and welcome to another book discussion in our Black Lives Matter discussion series. And today we will be talking about Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, Volume 1 by Joel Christian Gill. Before we get into it, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Marissa, and I work in the Outreach Department.
Hey, my name's Colin. I work in the Public Experience and Desk Service Department as a supervisor.
I'm Emily. I am a librarian at AADL.
My name is Jacob, and I also work in the Outreach Department.
I'm Emily, and I work in the Circulation Department.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and I work in the Youth Services Department at the library.
And my name is Lucy, and I also work in the Youth Services Department.
Excellent. So this is a graphic novel with different little vignettes of stories about different people throughout Black history and their struggles and triumphs. Does anyone have a favorite that they really want to talk about?
These are a lot of good ones. I think, the idea for this book is such a good one of just, there are so many stories out there that no one knows about. They're everyday stories that happened all the time that are shockingly amazing, right? And so many of these really were great. I mean, they saved a really fun adventurist one for last, I think, with the Bass Reeves, who is a U.S. Marshal who, in the Wild West, who goes on to capture over 3,000 fugitives and turn them into the law. And like he was raised by different, not raised, but as an escaped slave. He was taken on by some different tribes of Native Americans and learned all about their cultures and lived with them for years, and then was able to have those interactions to find these fugitives that are out. I mean, it was just a fun story, but there was a lot of, every one of these was pretty amazing too.
I really liked the Bass Reeves one because I had heard of him before, but I hadn't heard of any of the history behind his story. I just knew that he was a U.S. Marshal who had tracked down a lot of people. I didn't really know anything else about him besides that. So it was cool to see more about people I had heard of before, and it was cool to read a lot about people who I had never even heard of. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of any of these folks before, and I loved the variety of the different things that each person was known for or did very well or exceeded in. There's a magician, there's someone who excelled at chess, basketball, the cyclist. So they're fun things or things that are just things you might be really good at in your day-to-day life versus, being something that might be more notably distinguished or laudable. But I just like the variety of it. I mean, they all had a bit of humor and heart, but they all had that sense of darkness to them because these are people you hadn't heard of. Not the day-to-day people everybody has to be aware of, but it's great to hear these voices of resilience during such times of struggle and strife. So I thought it was really cool. It made me think of how many other people have these kinds of stories where they were able to persevere and come up with something and do it on their own. So.
I really liked the ordering of the stories. I thought that I'm sure with any book it was intentional, but that it really did a nice job of having a little more serious and then a little lighter. I think the one that definitely moved me the most were the 2 letters as written by Spotswood Rice, especially because in comparison to the others where you had the narrator, who I assume was the author, though that was never specifically said, telling the story. And in this, it was simply these words from these 2 moving letters with really compelling illustrations. And I think especially after reading some of the lighter stories were still the people that they focused on were still dealing with all sorts of prejudice and having to make it through the story of this man writing the letters to the woman who still had his daughter as a slave, and just the power of his conviction and his parenthood and the certainty that he was going to reunite. It built the story tension, and it was so compelling. But at the same time, the pacing of it with the illustrations, you had to go slowly to fully take it. I just thought it was that one chapter. If you're going to read only one part from this book, though, you should read them all because they're great. And they also are, it's a graphic novel. It doesn't take very long to read. Oof, that one I'm going to still be thinking about for a very long time.
I also thought the one about the island in Maine, the Malaga island, was a little bit different from the other stories. It didn't focus on one central person, and it also was it was a little bit, I mean, they didn't have a happy ending at all. But I think it's interesting that it's included in this story, because I feel like all these stories are sort of just like very much American. You know, here are different people making their way in America. And that is an example of a group of people building a community in America. And, you know, what happens to them. It's just a really sad story, especially because nothing's been done with that island. The other thing I would say about all of these stories that I enjoyed is that I think he gives you like some of this person's life. I looked up every single one of these people because I was like, I need to know, you know, how much of this is he telling us? What else is there? So I liked getting sort of this broad view of all these different people.
I sort of feel like the narratives in this book sort of like, as you're saying, like they sort of compel you, sort of like make you want to go and find out more, because you're like, oh, there's this, and I want to learn more about these people. And I think that was kind of touched on at like the very beginning in the letter, the foreword by Henry Louis Gates Jr., where he talks about like these are like the types of narratives that could be used to like say like, hey, these are stories of people in America who have had a lot of hardships, and like we should hear about them. So I like that it felt like it compelled me to want to know more about what was happening.
One of the thoughts or takeaways from reading this that I had was, if these are all, if this is just a small collection of unknown stories, what are the thousands and hundreds of thousands of other stories that we may never hear? And then I saw the number 1 on the spine of the book, and I was like, volume 2, volume 3. So that was a cool thing I experienced while reading it. Also, I just really appreciate the format. I think how we, the mode of communication in which history is passed down, perhaps those modes of communication can be diversified. Especially when that's so up to date or up to the debate in today's classrooms. So it's like, here's a sick comic book. It's just brimming with creativity and history and knowledge. Enjoy. There's I don't think it's wrong to say that reading this was a deeply enjoyable and entertaining experience as much as it was enriching and enlightening. So yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, there were so many fascinating bits of information about these people, and what were there, 9 in this? Like when it was done, I wanted more. Like all of the stories go by so quickly. I was reading it and I was like, oh, how many more do I have? I'm like, wait, there's only already halfway done. Like there's only one
more right here. Volume 2.
Well, when this one was
I actually
done,
owned this from before, but yeah.
It's such a quick read. Like I wanted more right afterwards. I wanted like, you know, at least 5 more in this set. But I was glad to see, is there more beyond volume 2 in this particular series? No. And I did notice that in the volume 2 that there's a handful of women that are depicted, which I was happy to see.
Mm-hmm.
I also was curious, and I know nothing about the author or how the book came about. like digging up these stories or these individuals to highlight how that process went and where do they come from, and like, do you pick ones that have kind of a twist you could put on it to make it a graphic novel or to make it not seem too awful or somewhat hopeful? I was just curious as I was reading it.
I think it's interesting. A lot of these stories take place in New England, which is like not always what you think of when you think about like Jim Crow and you think about post-slavery life and being slaves. He lives in New Hampshire, this author illustrator. But I think it's just so telling that like you can stand anywhere in this country and you can look at the towns around you. And if you start to pay attention to things like, you know, there are actual homes in here and graveyards and islands, like you will start to learn that these are stories that took place everywhere and not just like in the South, which we typically think of. So I did note that a lot of them seem to take place in New England.
I wanted to ask about favorites because there's so many different, like the variety of people in this book is so interesting. And like, even though I'm not a sports person, there's a basketball person. So like maybe I'll skim that, and then I'm really into chess or whatever. So there's many different things you can latch onto, which I think is really interesting. Like Amanda said, I was deeply disappointed there were no women in this book, which we'll maybe get into. But I really think it's an effective narrative of just, I mean, I also like short stories, so it works for me. I looked a little into the author, who he went to art school to become a painter, and he wanted to tell stories through paintings. And a good friend of his said, "You're trying to tell a story through this and you're failing." So he went back to his first love of comics and started drawing comics, which I think is like a really interesting approach. So I don't know how he picked these specific people, but I really like that approach. I like comic books. I like graphic novels. So I wondered if anyone else had any thoughts about his style, of if it was approachable, or if you liked the art, or if it.
It's really interesting hearing about him telling stories through paintings, because one of the things that really hit me with this is how though the art style isn't super detailed, it is super expressive. And so I think especially about giving this book to a preteen or maybe even a little bit younger, because there's so much to talk about in how you think the characters feel that is shown in the pictures, not in the words. And I think he does a really beautiful job of giving the information and letting it sit with the reader, where they can then make those leaps. Like it's the literal show don't tell. And I can just see this sparking really good conversation, not just obviously between groups of adults like us, but I hope and imagine conversation between kids and adults about some of the complicated things that happened in our past and that still happen in our present times. I think by allowing people to bring their own emotions to the table, instead of saying he felt sad, he felt scared, showing it and let the reader feel it. Ooh, he does such a good job of that.
I absolutely love the art. And to piggyback off of what you had said, Emily, I'm thinking about the two letters story, and this slave owner is yelling something, and at first it's yellow, and then he's yelling again and it's orange, and then he's yelling again and it's red. And it's like, what emotions fit into yellow? And then later in that same story, when the main character, Sherwood, right? I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. He's reading a letter, and at first his thoughts are yellow, and then his thoughts are orange. And it's like, I learned that language earlier in the story, and it was so rewarding to see that that language was carried throughout the entire story. There's something about the stork in the babies.
Yeah.
We were looking at a lot of babies and a lot of storks. There's something there.
The babies are just like thrown across the page.
Yes.
Yeah, and I like how the author did that, where you saw it for the first time in one story, like an image of a woman giving birth. It's like the same thing. Then, like 3 stories later, you see something similar. So it doesn't. It's sort of humorous, but it's just sort of like it's comfortable to see like the same sort of like thing, because the stories are so short. And we also get that with the image of the crows representing Jim Crow. Like that popped up in one story, and then it came up in then one right after it. And I was like, that was such a really great like visual metaphor for it, like literally being chased like by Jim Crow. I thought that was really, really well done. But I like the format. The book is a larger format graphic novel, which is nice. And some like nonfiction graphic novels can pack in so much information. They can try to have dialogue as well as so much extra like informational stuff about the year, the date, the time, the place, like within the same cell. And sometimes it's not bad that way. It's just more of a dense read. And this, it's nice because it's small. The illustrations fill the page, and you're still getting some of that exposition as well as the dialogue. And as you guys alluded to, the expressions on the faces. I really, really enjoyed the illustrations. The cover did not match the illustrations to me. The cover kind of threw me off. This book is one that I checked out a couple times, and it's popped up in other book discussions, but I never got around to reading it. And then once I cracked it and was going through it, I was like, well, why did I renew this for a couple of years? You know, because it's so delightful, or it has really, I really think it's well done for a nonfiction graphic novel. I think it's really accessible. The way I like the sort of handwritten font that the writing is, that's accessible. You can read it, because for some people who are newer to graphic novels, sometimes the format can throw you off and it's too hard to follow different pieces. And this was not too dense. The information was dense, but not the way it was laid out visually on the pages. So I really liked how I thought it was very well done for this book.
I liked the very first story about Henry Box Brown. You know, he escapes by hiding in this box and being shipped somewhere for 27 hours. And you can talk about that and be like, wow, that's amazing. But the in the drawings, it really depicts like, no, this is what it's like. You can see his body packed tightly inside. You're like, oh my gosh, think about that. Think about being in that position for more than 2 minutes. I would flip out. And it's just like how it put you right there, and it does it quickly. It just kind of jumps from thing to thing to thing, and it condenses so much with the stork with the baby. Oh, baby's here. And there's a picture and he had a new wife, and they got a new house. And then, but this thing happened, and things happened. I thought like you mentioned with the crows representing Jim Crow, I think the way he can graphically represent the harassment that they brought was very well done, and with one picture, you intimately felt, you can tell that it's just so difficult, and without having to explain it. There's not even words to explain it. It's just a graphic, and you instantly know what they're doing. So yeah, I really enjoyed the art in here as well.
I wondered about the crows and how they were depicting Jim Crow, not as it's a pun, right? Like Jim Crow, literal crows. It works on that. It's funny. My first reaction was like, is this maybe glossing over too much or taking away accountability of like that people were doing it? But on the other hand, it like makes it very accessible in a way, and it makes it kind of more lighthearted without being too graphically violent. I don't know. I wonder if anyone else had any thought about the crows being depicted as crows.
I thought that's different in like when you talked about the island, right? The shame. They were very explicit about the people who made the decisions to go after these citizens who were minding their own business and having their own community, and then decided, hey, we know better than them, and we're going to break this up and ruin this and send these people to horrible fates. And have people show up at the doorstep and try to take their whole community and throw it in a swamp. And, so they didn't do it there. It's interesting that they did kind of make it symbolic in other stories. Because I agree, to see white people doing the same things has a whole different effect, I think, than a symbolic crow doing that.
I do get a little sense with the crows of very much like this. They're like oppressive and they're dark and they're chasing you and they're hunting you down. And so I do think it like gives it a little bit of that feeling, but it is kind of punny. There's one part where he talks about the group of crows. Well, the group of people outside the window, it's all crows. They have murderous intent, which I thought was like both very smart because, you know, it's a murder of crows. It's very smart. Like, I think the illustrations are very, like, they tell the story really intelligently, but so I liked the crows.
I think the crows worked for me because, and I don't know how well this will pick up on camera, but they really carry themselves more like people than they do like birds, and they're human sized. And so getting that black mass with the points and the, you know, they don't have any words come out, but they have these at a couple different places when they're feeling the most rage, these dark red speech bubbles. And I think that helped turn it from being like, oh, isn't this a cute way to show this, to, oh, this would actually be really scary. Even taking away the metaphor, these giant black beasts coming towards you, all darkness and red pointy somethings. I think it did help make it be less of a cartoon and more of a real threat.
I think with so much visual media that depicts Black history, and the majority of this visual media is created by white people, strives for a sense of realism that is actually traumatic and doesn't really serve much of a purpose. I got the notion, which I always can be wrong, I got the notion that, especially with the main island story, when the white people were saying something racist, there wasn't words. There was just a speech bubble with an image of a stereotypical Black face. And that's the author being like, doesn't really matter what they were saying, it was some stupid, goofy stuff. And really, with visual media about these sorts of stories being so hyper-focused on depicting exactly what a slave owner might say that is deeply traumatic, I thought it was an interesting take to poke fun at racism and really reveal how silly and trivial it is. I don't even need to say the words. I can just draw this little image. And that lets you know everything you need to know. That's where my head was at. Mm-hmm.
No, I think you're right. I had the same thought at one point too, of like, you don't need to say the word or even part of the word to get people to know what that little speech bubble is supposed to represent, and saying it and depicting that stuff can be traumatic and re-traumatic for people. And in some of those cells that Emily showed, where it's like the mass of crows, and sort of to me read almost as like tentacles of like just this mass of things, and how it's like embedded in many things. I don't know if I'm being very articulate, but that's what I kind of had pictured as well. And I liked that it was like a consistent kind of visual language that he had in all of these stories, which he carries in some of his other books as well, which I liked. The more of his work that I've read, the more I've liked it, in a way of like, the more I know how to read it, if that makes sense. And then the other part of it, for what Jacob was saying, is just like, it allows it to be silly and goofy in a way. And like, the point of these stories as I read them is to just like be able to celebrate Black victory and joy and success and triumph. And it doesn't, even though they're overcoming things, it doesn't need to focus on just the overcoming, if that makes sense.
1,000 times yes. It is a celebration of uncelebrated Black figures in history. It is not a historical record of exactly the words the oppressors used. If you would like that, turn to a bevy of television programs, movies, books, really crack any book made on the topic between 1940 and 2000, and that's all it's going to be. Now I'm on one. I'm on fire.
It feels to me like these stories and like the points that you guys are bringing up, it says to me like these people, they're notable not because of their oppression, they're notable because they are amazing people.
Or both. Both of those things at the same time. Yep. You know what I'm trying to say?
A lot of the times they're on their way to doing amazing things, and then they're out of nowhere, they're just trying to live their life and do their thing, and then these people harass them and almost upend the story, right? And take it over. And so it's like, okay, not only was this person amazing, but then they had to deal with this junk and overcome that as well. And so, yeah, I thought I appreciated that about it.
So the comics, we talked about the comic style and the vibe of the book, for lack of a better word. Since we have people from different departments, what age range do you think this book is really meant for? Or who would you give this book to? Because I think we file it in our catalog as teen, but I could also potentially imagine a child reading this. And
yeah, I definitely could. There wasn't anything in here to me that I haven't already seen in other children's lit. And there wasn't any harsh violence or at least gruesome depictions of anything. It was all things that actually happened. And it was just done well. I think it was done at a level that kids would enjoy and understand. So I think that this is a middle grade style of book.
Agreed. I think the only thing that makes it more skew older are the introductions. And if you just move those to the back of the book, and then the really interested kids will keep reading them. That and like you talked about earlier, the cover not being quite as drawing. And I'll say too that the title. I mean, I think Strange Fruit is a hauntingly beautiful, meaningful song that is very important. And I don't know how much it matches the tone of this book. Mm-hmm. And while they're both pieces of culture that I will continue to think about and pieces of media that I'll continue to think about, I don't know that I have them tied together in my brain, despite it being the title of this book. But if you're talking about the contents of the page, like I said, give it to like a 5th through 8th grader who is interested in learning, and then be around to talk about it with them afterwards. You're setting both of you up for having a really meaningful experience.
I also think comics are just like a great sneaky way to teach. Yeah. So I'm glad I'm not the only one who thought that. So there's no women in this book, really. No main characters, at least, which I felt sad about. But not to discourage people, because in volume 2, women are mentioned. Did anyone else have any opinions about how women do appear in this book?
I found it interesting. We already mentioned that you kind of see the same birth scene over and over and over again, but you briefly see the labors of women, and that it is women who are bringing all of these amazing people into the world. And it just felt like the door was starting to open, and then it just didn't get there to tell some of the other stories. So it's not like it portrayed the women it portrayed. It did, it was showing important work that they did, but they were mostly unnamed, and their purpose of being there was birthing their amazing kin. Which is not
them or marrying them.
Yes, that too. So it was more an absence rather than a a poor portrayal, I guess, is what I would say. But
Which might align with, oh, sorry, go ahead. I was saying it might align with like the actual research and stories, these particular ones from history, like maybe, the women weren't named or recognized except for giving birth. I mean, he does have a couple in the other book, but women's stories might be much harder to unearth. It doesn't mean you can't, but like in telling these stories, there were women there, but that he might not have been provided with any information about them.
Well, I think for me, the thing was just a lack of women as the central character that a particular story was about. But it makes sense that all of these men had women in their lives that they were working for, that they were living with, or that they were parents to. But also, since the stories are so brief, it's sort of, you don't really learn about many of the other people in the cells, be they male or female or what have you. Not that I don't think there should be women with voices in these stories, but I think just to tell a quick, like 20-page, like graphic novel version of like an unknown person's life, it made okay sense to have them just in the background, the women or the other characters in the background themselves, because they were sort of like with the stork or like the crows, they were literally just like sort of like a prop in the background as the main character, the main person you were learning about, kind of moved along through the pages. Like if you think about it sort of like a painting, they were in motion, and then the other people that were in their lives, even if they were important, were sort of just like there. And I think that kind of idea lends itself better to this graphic novel format. It would be strange if I was just reading a quick like 15-page like short story with a couple of little illustrations that were for like, middle grade or teen. Like, I don't know how you would have still spoke of the importance or what some of the roles were of the women in the stories without actually saying or dedicating many like literal words in the paragraphs to them. So, but I am glad I did look up, because I'm like, okay, there's no women. How many are there in part 2? And I think there were like 4 out of 8 or something. So there's still some, but I do wonder, like Lucy said, like maybe they weren't as portrayed, or it wasn't documented, or like there was one image in here where it was like a double grave. One of them was the person's name. The next to it, like in typical fashion, was just like the woman's name. It's like wife of so-and-so, or they just like wife, mother. So it's interesting. And has anybody read the volume 2 stories? Is it similar for even when the women are portrayed? Is it similar with like the sort of the background characters literally just being like in the background, not as much of a character?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stories focus on the actions of the main character. It's been a while since I read this one, but it's pretty much the same format, I would say. Except there are stories centered on women. But, thinking again about like the actual history, I think if you think about, like, there are stories we know of women doing these amazing things, like, Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth, but those aren't the type of people that he's including in these books. He's not telling us the stories that we've heard and that we already know. So again, it might be like women were just not recorded, and
or there's not as much opportunity to do something amazing, like to be a world-renowned chess player or bicyclist or magician. That there wasn't an opportunity for those things.
There is one story that he wrote, if you're feeling like you need some more women in your life, which is always how I feel. He has this beautiful picture book. Sorry, the sun is right here, but it's about Bessie Stringfield, who is a famous motorcyclist. And there's this whole beautiful children's picture book about her. And then he also wrote, again, sun, sorry. It's called Tales of the Talented 10th. And there's 3 different books in that series. And Bessie Stringfield is a motorcyclist. She did so many cool things. She crisscrossed the whole US 8 times. She worked for multiple carnivals doing motorcycle tricks. She was married 6 times, which is interesting for the time. She was the sole woman in the US Army's civilian motorcycle courier unit during World War II. And then she's the first Black woman who was inducted into the American Motorcycle Hall of Fame and the Harley-Davidson Hall of Fame. And like, this is a picture book. It's more about her as a kid riding a bicycle, and then this is like her whole life. And it's a pretty quick read. So this book kind of felt very similar to The Strange Fruit, but it's obviously just more in depth, which I think is very cool. So if you're a fan of the art and his style, there's 3. One is the whole book about Bass Reeves, the lawman, which I would like to read. I haven't yet. And then I think his last one is about Robert Smalls, who has a very interesting story. I've heard of him, honestly, from Drunk History on Comedy Central. He was born a slave. He was sent off to Charleston to work on ships around Charleston. The Civil War broke out, and he ended up basically stealing a Confederate ship filled with weapons and sailing it and delivering it to the Union Army. And then he ended up being a congressman and having this like very interesting life. So again, that series is very interesting. It's Tales from the Talented 10th. And then most recently, I think he also collaborated with Ibram X. Kendi on a graphic adaptation of Stamped from the Beginning, which I would like to read.
Yeah, I want to read that. I read he has another graphic novel. It's a memoir called Fights. And it actually is really interesting I don't know, did you read it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought it was really good, but it also gives you a lot of background information about him and where he's coming from. And he basically was like huge, like he solved everything by getting in fights when he was little. And it's sort of the story of how that changed for him. But it just gives you a good perspective, I think, on who he is, who's creating these stories. I liked it.
Does anyone else have any other major thoughts or wants to dive into one of the stories in particular? Lucy, I know you said that you Googled each person. Were there any amazing facts that you learned that you were disappointed weren't included?
Not that I was disappointed weren't included, but like it was, well, I looked up, the story of Theophilus Thompson, the chess player, how they were like, and then he just disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him. I'm like, what happened to him? And for a long time, nobody did. And they were all these stories. And then some story came out that he lived a very long, fruitful life and he got married. And then it turned out that was not the story at all. And he stopped playing chess because he got TB. And I think he tragically died like really young of TB. So that was kind of like, oh, that's not, I mean, it does seem ominous at the end of that story that it just disappeared, but that wasn't the ending that, it was sad to read that. I also wanted to, like, with the basketball player, this is a case of just seeing all the other figures in his life and these names. And like one of them, Zadok Liu, I think they said he had like the biggest library or something. So, and I couldn't find much out about them, but I just was interested to know who are the offshoots of these, stories. And he gives you these names, and I wanted to know more.
There was the one about the school, and at the end it turns out that the William he was talking to was W.E.B. Du Bois. I thought that was a cool little,
yeah.
Because if someone who's reading this about history or like reading about like people like prolific figures in Black history, like that's a name that people have heard of. So it's kind of, I thought that was cool. I did think it was interesting, the cyclist too at the end, how like he lost all his money and then he was just buried in an unmarked grave. And then in 2008, they made that monument, and then they were able to pull their money and have him moved. I wonder how like that came about, because that's a long time later, which I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, there are also some places, like I liked the story of the illusionist a lot because like really his grand illusion was the fact that everyone didn't know he was Black. But those, like, you can actually go visit, his headstone and his wife's. I spend time in New Hampshire every summer, so I was like, oh, I think there's a number of places here you could go and see. And that's the other thing that I think is so interesting is that you walk around all the time, all these places, and these stories are there. I think I said that before, but they're there in the land and the places around you as much as they are in the people.
I also think it's funny that Henry Brown, who mailed himself free, also spent time as a magician. And this wasn't included. He was the only one I had actually heard of before I read this, but he then had to, because he was so famous for mailing himself free, he had to move to England after the Fugitive Slave Act so that he wouldn't be recaptured because he was so famous. And then he would tour with the box that he mailed himself in. And it was like part of his act in some way, which I just think is also fascinating. Yeah. Any other final thoughts on this one? All right. Also shout out, since we're talking about history, shout out to the Living Oral History Project as part of AADL. If you're just interested in local history, that's full of interesting photographs and articles, and it's part of our community collections. So check that out, or our walking history tour that you can also take that showcases historic Black neighborhoods in Ann Arbor if anyone else is interested in some local stories. Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here, for discussing with us, and I will see you all next time.